On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded China, reaching the northern portion of the Korean peninsula on August 10th. United States officials proposed a division of control over the Korean peninsula to occur at 38 degrees north of the equator in a similar manner to other U.S.-Soviet post-war territorial divisions taking place in Europe at the time. The Soviet government agreed, occupying the northern half of Korea, with U.S. forces controlling the other half. In late 1945, both sides agreed that this split was temporary until a trusteeship could be established that would lead to a unified and independent Korean state. However, negotiations between the two sides over the trusteeship fell apart over the next 2 years. In 1948, the problem of Korean government was turned over to the United Nations, or UN, which could not create a solution that was acceptable to the Soviet Union. This led to UN-supervised elections in the southern half of the peninsula, electing Syngman Rhee, while the new leader of the northern half, Kim Il-sung, gathered power. On August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea, or ROK, was formed from the southern half of Korea, while on September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was formed from the northern half. In March 1949, Kim began petitioning the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, for his support for an invasion of the Republic of Korea. Stalin initially withheld it, but gave his approval for an invasion in April 1950. The Soviet Union had detonated their first nuclear bomb, bringing them on an equal footing with the United States in that regard. Additionally, Stalin believed that since the U.S. had not intervened against communist forces in China, they would not try to stop an invasion of South Korea. However, reinforcements for Kim's invasion would come from China, as Stalin did not want Soviet forces to engage directly with American ones. Kim also met with Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, in May 1950 to discuss the invasion of the Republic of Korea. Throughout early and mid-June 1950, U.S., UN, and ROK military officials reviewed the strategic situation and were confident that either a North Korean invasion would not occur, or, if it did, that they could easily repel it. At the outbreak of war, the North Korean military, known as the Korean People's Army, or KPA, had between 180,000 and 230,000 troops, 487 aircraft, and 379 tanks in total between its invasion force and reserve force. In contrast, the ROK forces had 98,000 soldiers, no tanks, no heavy artillery or anti-tank weapons, and 22 aircraft. The KPA crossed the 38th parallel at dawn on June 25, 1950, attacking along the entire breadth of it. The ROK forces were quickly routed and pushed back. In desperation, Syngman Rhee and a portion of the ROK government evacuated Seoul on June 27th. On June 28th, ROK forces blew up the Hangang Bridge, which crosses the Han River and connects northern and southern portions of Seoul in order to delay the KPA advance. Thousands were still crossing the bridge, and hundreds of refugees, ROK soldiers, and police were killed. However, Seoul still fell to KPA forces on that same day. ROK forces rapidly diminished in strength from around 95,000 on June 25th to 22,000 on June 30th. U.S. leadership was caught off guard by the invasion, as they were more concerned with the Soviet Union exerting control over Europe than in East Asia. Korea was not within the Asian defense perimeter outlined by the U.S. Secretary of State. However, the U.S. government did consider Japan to be the key to countering the influence of China and the Soviet Union in the region, which heightened the importance of the Korean conflict in their minds given its proximity to Japan. Additionally, U.S. President Harry Truman and his advisors felt that they could not make the same mistake as other Allied leaders had in the late 1930s by trying to appease Hitler. Truman saw U.S. military action as necessary to contain the spread of communism, given his concern that a successful invasion of South Korea would deter other small nations from resisting communist aggression. The United States military of the summer of 1950 was substantially weaker than it had been just 5 years before, given that there had been substantial cuts in defense funding since World War II, and a refocus of military funding towards the creation of a nuclear bomber aircraft force at the expense of other branches. Other nations besides the United States and South Korea also made up the UN contingent. Across the entirety of the war, this included 56,000 troops from the United Kingdom, 27,000 from Canada, 21,000 from Turkey, 17,000 from Australia, and smaller forces from a number of other nations. The first substantial battle between US and KPA forces took place on July 5, 1950, with the Battle of Osan. American forces were steadily pushed backwards to the south throughout July and August due to their lack of preparedness, including limited numbers of tanks or anti-tank weapons. The KPA's advance finally ended in late August when UN forces were able to establish the Pusan perimeter, an approximately 140-mile-long defensive line following the Nakdong River that bounded a portion of southeastern Korea. UN forces within the perimeter were resupplied from Japan and San Francisco. By late August, they had 500 medium tanks, and by early September, their forces numbered 180,000 to the KPA's 100,000. The KPA was starting to have serious logistical problems, lacking food, equipment, and reinforcements. On September 1st, they attempted one last push to break the UN line, the Great Nakdong Offensive, attacking at 5 locations across the Pusan perimeter. Though they caught UN forces by surprise and almost succeeded, they were forced back through harsh fighting and substantially weakened. General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of UN forces in Korea, had been planning a decisive strike behind KPA lines via amphibious assault since the early days of the war. He targeted the city of Incheon, located on Korea's western coast, which had a number of drawbacks between fast ocean currents, substantial variations in tides, and the fact that the only 2 passages to the harbor were narrow and could easily be cut off with naval mines. Despite this, MacArthur insisted on attacking Incheon, given that he did not believe that alternative targets could produce a victory that was decisive enough, and that he expected to have the element of surprise because of the substantial challenges associated with landing there. The Incheon landings took place on September 15th and were very successful, with MacArthur winning great acclaim for his strategic genius. UN forces were able to retake Seoul and weaken the KPA's supply lines in South Korea, though the fighting to do so was slow and challenging, taking 11 days to advance the 20 miles to Seoul and recapture it. UN forces began their breakout from the Pusan perimeter on September 16th. They enjoyed sweeping success, similar to what the KPA had earlier in the year over the next month, crossing the 38th parallel on October 1st and capturing Pyongyang on October 19th. The Yalu River forms the border between China and North Korea. Debate began to arise among UN leadership about crossing it as their forces approached, with MacArthur wanting to traverse it and US President Harry Truman disagreeing. Additionally, on October 3rd, the Chinese government warned US officials that they would intervene in the war if UN forces crossed the Yalu, though US officials considered the statement to be a bluff. MacArthur also believed that Chinese forces could easily be defeated if they were lacking air support provided by the Soviet Union. Around 200,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu on October 19th, despite having no Soviet air support. They successfully limited the effectiveness of UN aerial reconnaissance by marching only at night and using aerial camouflage during the day. The first conflict between Chinese and US military forces came on November 1st at the Battle of Unsan, where they successfully encircled the US 8th Cavalry Regiment and caused the loss of much of its heavy equipment. At this point, UN forces were split into eastern and western elements by a swath of mountainous terrain ranging between 50 and 100 miles wide. On November 25th, Chinese forces launched a series of surprise attacks that heavily damaged the US 8th Army's right flank and allowed them to quickly bypass the UN front lines. The resulting Battle of the Chungcheon River lasted until December 2nd, with Chinese forces landing a decisive victory over UN ones and creating heavy losses, although the 8th Army was able to avoid being surrounded. The losses forced it to retreat 120 miles back to the 38th parallel and caused very low morale within it. Meanwhile, the U.S. 10th Corps and ROK 1st Corps had been advancing up the eastern coast of North Korea. The People's Volunteer Army, or PVA, forces successfully lured UN troops into the area around the Chosin Reservoir, which they then occupied by late November. The only avenue of retreat for UN forces was a 78-mile-long road leading to the port city of Hungnam, which was of poor quality. Additionally, the terrain around the road was quite mountainous and steep. Finally, during the time of the battle, temperatures dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, possibly as low as negative 36 degrees Fahrenheit / negative 38 degrees Celsius. On November 27th, PVA forces, numbering 120,000, attacked 30,000 UN ones, attempting to encircle them and cut off their escape route to Hungnam. UN forces managed to hold them off and break out from the reservoir area starting on December 6th. All of the remaining forces reached Hungnam by the evening of December 11th. 193 ships helped evacuate the UN forces and some Korean refugees by the afternoon of December 24th. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was essentially a draw. The PVA had managed to drive the U.S. 10th Corps out of North Korea, but the 10th Corps had remained largely intact against a much larger force. This battle ended the UN goal of total victory in the war and a reunification of Korea, as by the end of 1950 all UN forces had been pushed south of the 38th parallel. The PVA's successes in November and December convinced them to reject a ceasefire proposal and launch their third phase offensive in conjunction with the KPA on December 31st. They recaptured Seoul on January 4th, 1951, although they were unable to advance beyond it, given that their supply lines were too stretched out. The PVA fourth phase offensive began in mid-February, but was stopped at the Battle of Cheopyeong-ni. 5,600 U.S. and French troops were surrounded by 25,000 PVA ones, but still managed to hold them off, providing a substantial morale boost for the 8th Army. Operations Killer and Ripper followed in the second half of February and first half of March. UN forces recaptured Seoul on March 14th. By that point, a total victory was no longer seen as reasonable by U.S. officials, and they instead sought a ceasefire with the People's Republic of China. Indeed, simply holding all land south of the pre-war boundary of the 38th parallel could be seen as a victory by UN forces, given that they had successfully stopped the spread of communism. The PVA and KPA's last massive effort to push the UN forces off of the Korean peninsula came with the fifth phase offensive, occurring from April 22nd to May 22nd, which was their largest since the second phase offensive. It was ultimately a substantial failure, costing the PVA 102,000 casualties and convincing the Chinese leadership that, similar to the UN forces, they could not achieve a total victory and instead had to negotiate a ceasefire. Seeing that the PVA and KPA forces were exhausted and overextended following the fifth phase offensive, the UN ones launched a major counteroffensive starting on May 20th and lasting until July 1st, the last one of the war that led to substantial territorial gains for either side. UN forces retook territory to around several miles north of the 38th parallel, creating a new front stretching across the Korean peninsula named the Kansas-Wyoming Line. The UN advance halted there since ceasefire negotiations were about to begin. This line was fortified and almost entirely remained the front line of the war during the stalemate of the next 2 years. The two sides traded artillery fire along the Kansas-Wyoming line during that stalemate. PVA troops found it challenging to hold that front due to poor equipment and supply problems, including a lack of basic necessities like food and clothing. On the other side, U.S. public support had turned against the war by mid-1951 pressuring the Truman administration to seek an end to the fighting. Additionally, the U.S. Republican Party successfully used the Truman administration's handling of the war as a campaign issue, contributing to their gains in the 1950 and 1952 U.S. election cycles. There were two small offensives that took place during the stalemate period. First, UN forces engaged in one between August 31st and November 12, 1951. This included heavy fighting at the Battle of Bloody Ridge, Battle of the Punch Bowl, and Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, leading to 60,000 UN casualties. The offensive helped the UN forces to strengthen their defensive lines and caused between 100,000 and 150,000 PVA and KPA casualties, but it did not break the PVA and KPA line nor substantially change the course of the war. Additionally, in the summer of 1953, Chinese forces undertook operations to capture additional territory before an armistice was signed, including attacks on June 10th and July 13th. These were unsuccessful, leading to 72,000 casualties for them as compared to 14,000 for the UN. Armistice negotiations occurred in spurts from mid-1951 onward. A major sticking point between the two sides was the return of prisoners of war, as many PVA and KPA prisoners did not want to return to those armies after their release. The death of Stalin on March 5, 1953, accelerated negotiations, as the new Soviet leadership called for an end to the Korean conflict. An armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953, between the KPA, PVA, and UN leadership. It created the Demilitarized Zone, a 2.5-mile-wide buffer that forms the border between North and South Korea across the entire span of the peninsula. The modern-day boundary between the two nations does not exactly follow the 38th parallel. Rather, it reflects the territory held by each side when the armistice was signed, and thus runs at a slight angle to the 38th parallel. The Korean War is considered to be a frozen conflict, given that no peace treaty has ever been signed ending it, leading to tensions between North and South Korea that continue to the present day. Operation Glory, occurring from July to November 1954, allowed both sides to exchange the remains of dead soldiers for proper burial or commemoration. One important aspect of the war on the UN side was the tension between MacArthur and Truman. MacArthur had achieved acclaim during World War II as Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in the Pacific Theater, and later became the head of the American military occupation of Japan after their surrender in 1945. He led the American response to the invasion of South Korea in June 1950 and received substantial acclaim for the success of the amphibious landing at Incheon. However, MacArthur had a long-standing friction with President Truman, a Democrat. MacArthur was a staunch Republican and had made efforts to run for the Republican presidential nomination several times, including 1948, when Truman was seeking re-election. One significant moment of division between the two came in late August 1950, when MacArthur gave a public statement opposing Truman's approach regarding Formosa, now called Taiwan, which caused Truman to consider relieving MacArthur. The substantial success of the Incheon landings in mid-September 1950 greatly increased MacArthur's popularity and thus made his decisions much more difficult to challenge. Truman and MacArthur met about a month later at Wake Island, an atoll in the Pacific Ocean. The meeting was not a substantial discussion about military matters or strategy, but more so political posturing for both individuals, though one key moment came when MacArthur significantly downplayed the risks of Chinese intervention in the conflict. However, he was soon to be proven wrong, as Chinese forces pushed UN ones back throughout November and December 1950. UN forces were able to reverse their successes through the first few months of 1951, leading Truman to consider negotiating a peace agreement. MacArthur undercut him, though, by announcing that China should declare its defeat. The final straw came in April 1951, when MacArthur sent a public declaration which was read aloud in the U.S. House of Representatives that directly criticized the Truman administration's handling of the war and foreign policy strategy in general. MacArthur was officially relieved on April 11th and replaced as Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Forces by Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway. Truman's decision to relieve MacArthur was effectively the end of his political career, given MacArthur's popularity, as his approval rating sunk to just 22%, and he did not seek the Democratic Party's nomination for the presidency in 1952. The Korean War occurred at the intersection of significant technological changes in the development of military aircraft. Both older piston-driven aircraft, some of which were holdovers from World War II, and cutting-edge jet-driven ones played a significant role in the air forces on both sides of the war. Two of the most famous jet aircraft from the war were the MiG-15 and F-86 Sabre, often coming into conflict in a region of northwestern Korea named MiG Alley. Besides duels between fighter aircraft, two other major roles for United Nations aircraft came in the form of strategic bombing and close air support for ground forces. Finally, the Korean War saw the first substantial deployment of helicopters for use in medical evacuations by UN forces. The Korean War featured only limited naval combat, given that both Korean nations had small navies. One minor action came on July 2, 1950, when two UN cruisers and one frigate engaged 4 North Korean torpedo boats and 2 gunboats, sinking 3 of the former and both of the latter. UN naval forces also patrolled the North Korean coasts in order to prevent ocean-based resupply for their forces. Finally, UN ships supported land-based actions through methods like coastal bombardment. For instance, UN cruisers and destroyers shelled KPA targets near Incheon on September 13th and 14th, 1950, in preparation for the landings the next day. Historians estimate that 2 to 3 million civilians were killed during the war. The percentage of civilians killed as a portion of total casualties, estimated to be 50 to 70%, was higher than World War II and the Vietnam War. It's also estimated that 12 to 15% of the entire North Korean population was killed by the conflict. The significant number of civilian deaths was due to massacres, starvation, and the spread of diseases. This included the Bodo League massacre in the summer of 1950, where South Korean government forces killed an estimated 60,000 to 200,000 suspected communists. Additionally, the war destroyed almost all significant cities in both North and South Korea. It's also important to note the substantial mistreatment of UN prisoners of war by North Korean forces, including torture and forced labor. Finally, US forces conducted a massive bombing campaign against North Korea, dropping 635,000 pounds of bombs over the course of the war, more than was dropped by US forces in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. This campaign destroyed a significant majority of the cities, villages, and buildings across the country. It also included bombing 5 North Korean dams in May 1953, the destruction of which put several million North Koreans at risk of starving to death until they received aid from their allies. Most scholars consider the widespread US bombing to be a war crime. Finally, in the United States, the Korean War is often considered to be the Forgotten War, occurring between 2 much more well-known conflicts, World War II and the Vietnam War. The general American population was sick of conflict after the harsh fighting of World War II, with many soldiers returning from that conflict wanting to start families and reintegrate into civilian life. Another conflict just 5 years later, especially one occurring in East Asia, which was not well known to Americans at the time, did not draw the general population's attention.